The Alewives. A Plague Era tale of murder, friendship, and fine ale. Written by Elizabeth R. Andersen. Narrated by Ella Lynch. Hochsommer, in which a hoe has gone missing. It was only the second day of the holy feast of St. John the Baptist, and Frau Gritter, the wife of Georges le Porteur, was sure that her children would not survive until Michaelmas. She had 12 of them, you see. Frau Bertha, the pious primping hussy 2 doors down, only had 4, those that lived, and they were the pride of Colmar. Sweet, hard-working, intelligent, and beautiful, each one of them. Gritter's lank-haired children were all destined to be grifters. From Lisette, the eldest, to what's-her-name, the youngest, who Gritter only recently managed to detach from the teat. It didn't matter. None of her children would survive anyhow. If Gritter didn't thrash them into oblivion, then starvation would get them first. She pondered this as she scattered a pile of weeds and barley hulls for the hens that scratched alongside her large but shabby house on Trench Lane in Les Tanneurs. Colmar, known for its fine wines and rich, abundant soil, was a pretty city, full of fine people, except those who lived in Les Tanneurs, the tanners' quarter. Les Tanneurs contained the city's dyers, tanners, and leatherworks, conveniently located downstream and downwind of the wealthy burghers' homes near the church and the priory of the Dominicans, and the poorest occupants of Les Tanneurs lived on Trench Lane, which took its name from the deep walled ditch that furrowed the centre of the street. In dry times, the ditch filled with dung and other refuse that tripped passers-by. But when the rains fell, it became a temporary stream that shunted filthy water into the canals. Those that didn't live in Les Tanneurs called it the Stinkards. People told Gritter she was fortunate. No one in her family, including herself and good-for-nothing Georges, had died of the great pestilence, the plague of buboes that had ravaged the whole of the Rhineland from Annecy to Frankfurt. Some even claimed that the pestilence stretched throughout the whole of the earth, like a demon from hell, holding all of God's creatures in its grip of death and horror. The intact survival of such a large family was an immense rarity, even in her city, which had not had the worst of it. Not like Strasbourg. Her children, those that were old enough, worked odd jobs around the city, running errands, mucking out stalls in the innkeeper's stables, or swindling kind-hearted traders on market days. Her eldest daughter, Lisette, worked as a washerwoman at Lord Frieder's castle in the hills, keeping the old nobleman distracted while he waited for Lady Marguerite to give birth. Gritter always knew Lisette's pretty face would serve her well some day, and she didn't begrudge the girl this little indiscretion. It would never come back to benefit them, but it couldn't hurt them either. After all, how far could they sink below their present station? Georges worked as a porter at the docks in Vogelgrün when there was a need, and after the pestilence, there was far less need. Sometimes he helped move barrows of foul, stinking animal soil used by the tanners, or worked in Lord Frieder's fields. But most of the time he spent his days curled up in a pile of straw near the fire, snoring in a cloud of wine fumes. One of her children strolled lazily into the dooryard, kicking up little puffs of dust at each step. But which one was it? Gritter mentally listed her children's names, trying to assign the correct one to the long-faced lad. Erbe, Anstedt, Matthäus, Egelhard? Ah, of course, it was Lonel. tall and lean as a barley straw, with a perpetually bemused expression on his face. Lonel was the pebble in Greta's shoe and the fly in her porridge. Always in trouble, just like his father, but with the quickest laugh and the easiest smile, Lonel always seemed to be telling a joke or laughing at one. But while he charmed and flirted with his golden tongue, he was usually stealing food or money with his roving hands. Greta planted hands on hips that were once round and soft, now bony and sharp, from years of sorrow and starvation, and narrowed her eyes in her sternest fashion. "Well then, my best garden hoe has gone missing. I suppose you did something with it, did you?" "Ma!" Lonel laughed. "Why would I take your hoe?" "Why, indeed. I shouldn't have asked, for I know you've never done a lick of work in your life." Lonel shrugged in acknowledgement. He wore his notorious laziness like a badge of pride in Les Tanneurs. When a tanner asked for help lifting the hides from one of the soaking pits, Lonel just laughed. When a good wife struggled beneath a load of firewood or a basket of vegetables, Lonel would slink away. The only time he ever seemed to present himself amongst his neighbours was to observe one of the many illegal games of stones and bones, or else he would show up when a tinker or a new trader came to town, brandishing coins that Greta knew were ill-gotten. "It's washing day, and the girls are down at the riverbank, so I'm going round with Gerhard to find me a wife. Don't mind, do you?" Lonel drawled. "What? Better you would catch eels instead of a wife, or we'll have no supper tonight." "Thanks, Ma." Lonel retreated before Greta could question him further. "No young maid would want you for a husband until you learn to show your ma some respect," she shouted after him. Greta understood the futility of this complaint, but felt she must voice it all the same, to assert herself as someone who had a few years of experience above this child. Lonel stopped and laughed. "You're funny, Ma. The washing girls aren't maidens. They can't even clean their reputations." "Hey, your sister is one of those washing women." "Aye, that's how I know," Lonel called back without looking over his shoulder. As he retreated, his slim silhouette wavered in the late afternoon heat. If this had been her firstborn, Greta might have slumped wearily back into the house and mourned for the reputation of her legacy. But Lonel was only her sixth-born. Most days she didn't remember that he still lived under her roof, if he came home at all. She supposed this might make her a deficient mother, and then she figured that it didn't matter. If Lonel were to wed, she would have an excuse to toss him out, and that would be one less mouth to feed. Who cared if he took an unchaste washerwoman for a wife? A faint whiff of a song drifted on a puff of hot wind and into Greta's ears. She froze, the chickens at her feet scratching about restlessly, the problem of the missing hoe forgotten. "In the booze, you're a loser, if the dice you're shaking." The sultry summer heat rose in waves from the dusty dooryard, but the shadows grew long as the day pulled back to allow the night to advance. As the singing drew closer, Greta groaned. Georges was on his way home from the fields, his drunken voice ringing out for the whole neighbourhood to hear. She quickly pulled the drying swaddling rags from the tree branches, where she hung them in the sun to bleach, and hurried into the house, slamming the door. Georges' singing grew louder and more boisterous. "You'll get hurt and lose your shirt and sit there cold and quaking." When he burst through the door, Greta had sliced a loaf of brown rye bread and spread it with a thick smear of soft cheese from their little goat. Georges dropped heavily into a chair at the head of the table. He had the top of his tunic untied, showing a skinny chest of leathery skin, and bits of straw dangled from his untidy brown hair. He flashed a crooked smile at his wife.
"Greta, my dove, the fields were harsh today. So much heat. It is too much for a man to bear."
Greta pressed her lips and held out her hand. "Give it here, then."
"Give what? Where?"
"Your wages. Were you paid in coppers or something else today?"
"Oh, yes."
Georges reached into the shabby leather sack that still hung at his waist and pulled out a handful of wilted poppies, presenting them to her with a flourish.
"Flowers of the field, but they are not as beautiful as you, my dove."
Then he waited, a grin splitting his craggy face. "Where's the money, Georges?" Greta circled him. "Did you receive grain? Goods? You were gone all day, and now I want to see what you received for it."
"I was paid with a jar of the finest wine that Lord Frieder's cellarer had to offer."
He smacked his lips. "Oh, and where is this fine wine now?"
"Had to quench my thirst. It was hot as a forge in the fields, as I said. Lord Frieder has the largest crop of barley in the valley, and it took a fair effort for us all to harvest. Why, we were parched and crying out for rain when it was all over, and then the cellarer appeared with his nectar of heaven. I prayed to the Lord God for water, but as only wine was available, I had to drink it. For my health, you see. It was a miracle, it was."
Greta closed her eyes, her mouth set in a firm line. She didn't know why she even asked, as the answer was clearly in front of her. The wine fumes radiated from Georges's body, overpowering the smell of the tannery next door. He reached out a hand and grabbed the skirt of her threadbare cot, pulling her to his lap.
"Here now, old girl, don't fret yourself. I reckon I can make you feel better if you give me a chance."
He waggled an unkempt eyebrow at her.
"Of course."
Greta smiled. "Let me pour you a drink first." She rummaged in the cupboard and found a jar of old wine, so thick and foul that she almost had a mind to run it through a bit of cloth to strain the clumps of debris out first. Filling Georges's cup to the top, she presented it to him and left the jar on the table. Georges poured himself another when he had finished, and Greta arranged a wimple over her hair. "I'm off visiting," she announced.
"Sir?"
Georges's eyelids were already beginning to slip downward. "Feed the children, will you?" she called sweetly, before she slipped out of the house into the twilight. Cats Large and Small, in which Colmar gains a new widow. Across the dusty lane, the wavering flame of a rushlight glowed from an open doorway that belonged to Frau Appel Schneider. An old ginger cat lazed on the threshold, taking in the remnants of heat that radiated from the wattle and daub walls, which Appel's husband had painted bright yellow. That was years ago, of course, and the paint now flaked off, leaving exposed brown patches of plaster and woven willow twigs. After the hand of the great pestilence took him, Appel buried her husband in the garden behind the house, because there was no more space in the consecrated ground of the cemetery, where the bodies were stacked like logs under the sod. A local priest had been kind enough to bless the dirt in her garden, so she had enough room to lay her only daughter's bones to rest a few weeks later, along with her infant grandson and the little orphan boy who served as their hired hand. Of her family, Appel was the only one who survived. Her story was neither unusual nor pitisome after the great pestilence. Times were hard for everyone. Greta peeked through the open door. She no longer worried about Apple as she did a year ago, when things were so terrible for all of them in Colmar, but for a moment the profound silence in the house frightened her. Not long ago, when a house fell silent, you knew what had happened before you even looked in the window. How many times in the preceding years had she stopped in to check on a neighbour, only to find them dead, their flesh pocked with sores? How many times had the wail of a new orphan been met with exhausted indifference from his neighbours? Not enough times for her to grow accustomed to the sound. She crossed herself for protection from the devil and stepped inside. "Apple, dear, are you in?" Silence. The cat stood, stretched, and began to wind himself between her ankles. Greta looked around the room. It was simple, like all houses in Colmar that didn't belong to the wealthy burghers of the highborn. Walls of yellowing plaster, a dark, heavy-beamed ceiling, and a generous hearth of soot-blackened stones from the Rhine. Apple's husband had been a well-respected tanner before the pestilence took him, and so they could afford more finery than most. A bench of carved and painted oak stood near the fire. A few tapestries hung on the walls, finely stitched with Apple's own embroidery, and there was a chipped basin of almost pure white pottery. This house even had a second floor just for sleeping. Something thumped overhead, and Greta jumped. "Apple!" She ran from the house and around the corner, where a staircase wound crookedly up the wall to the second floor. She was on the first step when Apple's smiling face appeared in the shadowed doorway above her. "Ah, Greta, it is a pleasure to see you, my dear." Apple pulled her apron strings around her waist and tied them snugly. They were long enough to circle her twice. As long as Greta had known her, Apple had always been plump and jolly. But like everyone in Colmar and the surrounding burghs, she grew scrawny and faded after the great pestilence. Not enough food, not enough will to live. Her clothes hung from her body like dead leaves, but nothing could darken the brightness of her smile, despite the fact that she was getting on in her years. Greta grinned to hide her relief. "Sometimes I still forget that we live in better times now. I have come for your counsel, old friend." "Oh, and how can I help?" Apple walked down the stairs, adjusting her skirts and running her hands over her long braid to smooth the stray silver hairs. She took Greta's arm in hers and led her inside the house. "My womb collects children like honey attracts ants. I seek a potion to relieve me of this uncontrolled fertility." Apple's face was stony for a moment. "I am a good woman of the church, Greta. I do not deal in such sin." Overhead, another thump startled them. Greta quirked an eyebrow at her friend, and Apple shrugged. "Cat." Greta turned and looked at the doorway, where Apple's ginger cat had resumed its languid posture. "Well, I have more than one cat," Apple said with irritation. Overhead, more thumps, this time in the distinct pattern of heavy footsteps. "A very large cat," she muttered. "Would you like me to step out so you can bid farewell to your visitor?" "No, thank you. He will see himself out through the window." "Well then," Greta leaned forward, "about that potion." The shadows of the late afternoon melted into the thick, soft twilight of a sultry summer evening. Greta and Apple shared a pitcher of wine and cackled at each other's jokes in front of the hearth. The rushlight had long since burned through, and because of the expense, there was no chance of another one. So they sweated in the flickering light of the small fire as the heat of the day's sun cocooned the house. Greta didn't usually take so much wine, but on this night she enjoyed the weightless feeling of being slightly drunk. If Georges could intoxicate himself every day, then she could do the same every fortnight. She smiled crookedly at Apple, a sudden feeling of sisterhood swelling in her heart.
My dear neighbour, how long have we known each other?
As long as I have lived here, and I married my husband and moved into this house when I was still a comely young lass. Apple hiccuped into her hand, and you but a babe still. I used to mind the house for your ma when she would go a-marketing, and more than one time I did redden your buttocks when you tormented your little brother.
Aye, Gritter nodded. He was a fine young thing, my brother, though I teased him so. It was a pity what happened to him when he fell into that well.
Apple crossed herself, and for a moment they drank in silence, the light of the fire flickering across the caverns that the great pestilence had carved into their faces. Gritter straightened her shoulders and squinted at her older friend.
And all that time, you ain't never done no witching.
Faithful as the sun rises, Apple, people do like to talk about you, and it ain't flattering. Apple squirmed into a more comfortable position on the hard-packed earthen floor. I ain't no witch, Gritter, and I am surprised that you asked. But there was that time when old Laurent, the candle-dipper, fell through his own thatched roof, and we thought he would never walk again. You had him on his feet in a day, but that very evening the child of Marie, the butcher's wife, died. Coincidence? People die, and sometimes people die on the same day that foolish old coots like Laurent the candle-dipper fall through their houses. Gritter narrowed her eyes at her friend. But then there was the time that you tended to Frau Widmer when she was afflicted with the great pestilence, and she recovered. No one recovers from the great pestilence, Apple. No one. Apple took a long draw from her dish of wine. Frau Widmer is too mean to die. The devil doesn't want her any more than St. Peter does.
It was a shame that, Gritter mused. The neighbourhood would be quieter without her.
Don't speak such sin, Gritter.
'Tis also a sin to rid a woman of a child. Yet every woman in Colmar knows that you can do it.
Not through potions, nor incantations, my dear. I ain't no witch. I help women remain without child through revulsion.
Tell me again, Apple, how does this revulsion against children work? And what does revulsion mean?
Ah, yes. Apple straightened and cleared her throat with the gravity of a philosopher. You take the womb of a she-goat who has never borne a kid and carry it against you when Georges starts a-ploughing in your field. This will prevent you from getting with child again. Mark me.
They looked at each other and laughed.
Well, it works because he doesn't wish to go investigating anything so foul. You see? Revulsion.
They roared with such laughter that they didn't hear the knock at the door. Finally, after several attempts, the door slammed open with a bang, and a familiar weathered face peered in at them.
"Gritter, where are you, woman?"
"Ah, I had better be off then. Georges has found me." Gritter massaged her sore shoulders and groaned as she drunkenly struggled to stand.
"We were just talking about ploughing, Georges, although there will be none of that if I can't find my missing hoe."
Refreshed from his drunken nap, Georges was uncharacteristically sure-footed. He grabbed Gritter by the arm and hefted her to her feet.
"We need your help, and here you both are, drunk as hens at a bowl of sour bread. Young Harold Cleven has gone and got himself killed, and his wife is beside herself with wailing. Can you both see to her while we take care of the body?" Apple jumped up, immediately sober.
Harold's wife? Harold's wife? She mused. Is she the pretty young lass who moved here from Cleve only last year?
The same. The poor girl's husband was walking back to his home and was too lazy to make his way to the bridge, so he decided to vault over the canal with a branch.
Well, he was a strong young lad. Surely he could have made it over the canal on a branch, Gritta exclaimed.
The branch broke.
Could he not swim? Gritta asked.
Who knows? He was carrying a sack of hammers back to the smithy when he vaulted, so would it matter? Poor fool drowned, and once the hammers sank into the mud, his body floated down to the Dominicans. But he's blocked up the stream, and now he's a-flooding all of the prior's fields. Oh, the prior is furious, he is. Says this will be the end of his cabbage crop for sure.
Doomkopf, Gritta muttered.
Don't go speaking to the prior that way, wife. You'll bring an evil spirit on us.
I wasn't talking about the prior. Where is the poor girl now?
She's at her house, and no one can console her.
Gritta and Apple exchanged a look. Now that the great pestilence was over, there were fewer opportunities to provide the benevolent and often unasked-for charity of the healthy. Sanctimoniousness was a rare and intoxicating liquor that must be consumed when available. The two women scrambled into action, and in no time they had their aprons straightened, their wimples fixed into place, and a basket of provisions dangling from Apple's arm. They were ready to provide comfort and cheer, whether Harold's widow wanted it or not.